Hello, and welcome to another episode of What the Field. I am Roman.
And I'm Cristina.
Today, we're joined by Brent Loken, Global Food Lead Scientist at WWF. Brent, we're so lucky to have you here with us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, it's very happy to be here. I think I'm the one that's lucky to be able to have this conversation with innovators like yourself who are working on how do we actually, fix and how do we innovate and, create the type of food system that we want. So
can't wait to get to it. So for those who don't know about WWF, could you briefly introduce it? And also, what do you do as a Global Food Lead Scientist? What is your role within the organization?
Yeah, so WWF is the world's largest conservation organization. I think that probably most people have heard of us. We are the panda. That's kind of our iconic representation. I think what most people think about when they think about WWF, they probably think about animals. It's saving those iconic creatures like the tigers or the pandas or the elephants, and that's historically been our work. Recently, though, we've been transitioning more into systemic issues and some of those drivers of what is actually causing the loss of biodiversity, the loss of these species, the loss of these last great forests, and that's where food kind of fits in, right? So we added the food program, I believe it was 2016 or 2017, and I believe at that time, and still, we're one of the only conservation organizations in the world focusing on food and the impacts that it has on some of these species. So I think that's a very important thing because, we're not going to be able to protect these species. We're not going to be able to tackle climate change unless we address some of these large systemic drivers like food and food systems, and also consumption, which is, I think, what we're going to talk about today. So as the Global Food Lead Scientist, what I do is I am in charge of all the science-related food work within the network. We're in nearly 100 countries around the world, and my job is to help coordinate some of the work, coordinate some of the science, and really try and make sense of it, not only at like the global level, but what it looks like on the ground in different countries, for different offices, for different people, for different cultures, different culinary traditions, and really drive the science behind that.
Amazing. Sounds like a fun and complicated job at the same time, Brent. And what got you here?
Both fun and complicated. Yeah. But all jobs should be fun and complicated, right?
Yes.
So
maybe what makes them fun is that they're a bit complicated. If it's too easy, maybe it's not as fun.
exactly.
And what got you interested in food specifically, Brent? What's your story? What got you here?
Well, I was actually in Indonesia at the time, living with the Dayak people, East Kalimantan, and I was running an NGO that we started. This is back in, what was it, 2006, 2007? And the idea with this NGO at that time was to work with local communities, to work with the Dayak people on helping them to protect some of their forests, some of their forest traditional lands that had been with some of these cultures and with these Dayak for many, many years. So we started this NGO and we did some education campaigns, education within the community, internally, externally, worked on tourism, worked a lot in research. And it was at that time that I started to realize that the issues about working with the Dayak people were so complicated, involving not only internal, but also these large external systemic drivers, right? That are, if you're looking at coal mines or palm oil plantations, right? And I figured at that time that what I wanted to do was get my PhD. So I got my PhD, working with what it would take to protect some of these forests, working with local communities, and the best way to use community-based conservation in order to be able to save some of these species. So that's what I did my PhD in. But also with running the NGO, more on like the on-the-ground practical side, is I realized that so many of the issues always came back to food and health. And even though that we wanted to come in and look at things like orangutans and clouded leopards and monkeys and these, fantastic species, for local communities, a lot of it came back to what they were eating, what their kids were eating. It came back to economics. It came back to how am I going to put food on the plate? What food should I put on the plate? How do I make sure that my kids are healthy, right? So I started to realize that, food was such a large issue. And of course, we all know the issues with like palm oil, and palm oil is the main food, which is driving the destruction of many of these forests. So it all actually came back to food, but at the same time, it was bringing in economic development. So there was these interesting positions about palm oil plantations coming in and building roads and starting schools and doing all these great things, but at the same time, doing some bad things at the same time. So I started to realize that, maybe the way of protecting the orangutans and the clouded leopards and all these wonderful species that I love and many other people love is to actually work on food instead, and to work on some of the global issues and drivers beyond food systems. And maybe that was an entry point to be able to actually protect these species. So I came out of the jungle, stopped working for this NGO, which I founded, and started working on more of the global drivers of food systems. And that's when I went to EAT. I'm not sure if you know EAT.
Yeah.
Small food-based organization based out of Oslo, Norway, doing some really cool things, really innovative things with food. And I think EAT was one of the first organizations that really kind of landed food on the international radar, at a very interesting level. Worked at the EAT for 4 or 5 years, led the EAT Lancet report, was one of the leads on that. Then from that, I realized, I just had this feeling that I wanted to come back to nature, back to an organization that was working to protect these animals that I loved, and also back to an organization that was international, that was in so many countries around the world. Because I felt like if we wanted to really tackle these global problems, we needed a large global organization. So I've been working at WWF now for 3.5 years, working globally, also working locally, and it's been fantastic.
And Brent, how do you see WWF, like the role of the organization in changing food systems, or do you limit yourselves perhaps to doing research, or do you actively involve yourselves with government, try to change things? What's your approach?
My view on science is you can't limit yourself just to science. I think there's a role for science, but if scientists stay within the narrow realm sometimes of what science is, and then they don't engage with the public and they don't engage with policymakers, then they're missing a key opportunity, right? And I think those days of doing science in a vacuum, those days of doing science for the sake of doing science, they might be gone. And I'm not saying that there's still not a place for it, but I do think that there's a responsibility that all scientists need to have, given the urgency of many of the issues that we face, that we have to be thinking about science in a new way. And we need to be thinking about, how can we use science to solve really big problems? And a lot of that means how do we engage with policymakers, and how do we help policymakers make sense of the science and make it relevant? I think we've used the term complicated a couple times today already. And the thing about science is sometimes it is complicated, but it's also our job to simplify it. It's also our job to help policymakers to look at the science and understand what it means for them in their context. Because policymakers are dealing with very different issues sometimes. They're more worried about one issue, and we need to figure out how to make food relevant for the issues that matters to them. But again, this is where food is such a great thing to work on, because you can use food as a leverage point or like an avenue to protect orangutans and tigers and elephants and other things, or you can talk about health. If health is the thing that a policymaker is most important to them, because they're facing significant burdens of undernutrition within their context, then health is a way to be able to use that as an entry point, and in turn save some of these areas.
Yeah, we're going to touch on both a bit later on, but I want to ask you, what are the main barriers you encounter to do your job, perhaps, or when talking to policymakers? What is that really slows down the change?
Well, I think policymakers, like I've said, they have their own issues that they're dealing with, right? And there's 195 countries, more or less. Each one is different. Each one is context dependent, and trying to make sense of that is a huge barrier, right? people understand, and then they're finally starting to realize that food and food systems are extremely important, that we can't fight climate change, protect biodiversity without actually transforming food systems. But then relating that down to the level for like a policymaker that where they can understand what that means for them on the ground, that is a huge barrier. And when you look at food systems, I mean, people have been talking about climate change for a long time, very long time. But they've only recently been talking about food systems and the impact that food systems have, right? So we have a lot of catch up to play, and a lot of catch up in terms of helping policymakers understand why food systems are vitally important and why they should include them in their NDCs or their NBSAPs or other sorts of health and national level policies. And huge barrier, but huge opportunity as well. One other thing actually, though, just to add on that, and we might want to expand on this later, is that people all have a personal connection to food. They don't necessarily have a personal connection to climate change and everything is some kind of far off concept that they
You can't see it. It's true.
What?
You can't see it if it's not in front of you for many people, for most people.
Everybody eats though, right? Everybody has a link to a memory. They have a culinary tradition, a way of cooking food. And that's why that is also, it's a barrier. It's also an opportunity, but you also can get to the point where people say, keep your hands or your ideas, off my food.
And going back to that personal part, Brent, and to the fact, I believe that policymakers need to work with societies because it's kind of a joint effort. Like I make the policy, but there has to be people that want to support that and change their behavior and adopt that policy. And you need people to do that kind of behavior change, right? And as you said, it's something we do every day, and we shop every day, we cook every day, we eat every day, and it's when you get more and more into these topics, it again it gets complicated, right? You get kind of this anxiety of what should you see the evil everywhere, right? You go shopping, you need to cook, you need to order, and it gets complicated. Which path should I follow? Is it veganism? Is it plastic free? Is it local? What battle should I go for? And even when you get deeper into the issue, when you're studying it from, for example, ourselves from crowd farming, it gets complicated in terms of, is it carbon footprint? Is it water? Is it ethical issues? Is it certification? So in which battles should we focus at consumers? Where should we look into?
As consumers, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
I agree that it can be extremely complicated, and I think that sometimes the environmental or the food movement is our own worst enemies. There's so many labels we want to place on things, and some people say, no, it's about local farming, or it's about organic farming, or it's about regenerative farming, or it's about it's a vegan diet. No, it's a vegetarian diet. It's a pescatarian diet. No, actually, a carnivore diet is best, right? And I think that people working within the food system and on food issues tend to divide, and they tend to overcomplicate when it doesn't need to be actually that overly complicated, right? I think when you look at the issues and when you look at general trends, it's fairly simple. I think we tend to know our gut instinct when we walk into a store. We know what is probably natural and what isn't. We probably have this gut instinct in terms of knowing that a highly processed packaged food might not be as good for us as a fresh vegetable, which is just glowing with color, sitting right there in front of you.
Yeah.
Right?
Now we need to convince kids that is the best for them too, because that's complicated. The colorful and the creative can be magnetic. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a simplicity behind this. Even when you're looking at what to eat, there is a simplicity behind you eat more plants and vegetables, and you eat less animal source foods. You don't have to get rid of them all the way, but eat less, eat more plants and vegetables, eat more whole grains, less sugar, and drink water. It's a very simple message that I think that everybody can get behind, and then you don't have to get caught up in the nuances of is a vegan diet healthy or unhealthy? Well, Coca-Cola is actually vegetarian. There's no animal source foods in that. So well, why not just drink Coke and eat chips, right? But that's our job. And that's our job as communicators and scientists and everybody else, to be able to simplify it, not make it so complicated, and to help consumers, along the way.
And yeah, maybe a message to consumers would be not to be too hard on ourselves. Like it many times is not going to be perfect, but we should walk into that direction, right? Going back to the simplicity of it all. And maybe once it comes with plastic, okay, I'm going to be, I need to work the best with the options I have, right?
Yeah, and you pose the question as a battle, and I'm not sure if it's I'm not sure if I'd pose it as a battle, because I think sometimes the food movement tend to wage battle on certain groups and certain individuals if they eat or do certain things, right? And I'm not a firm believer in shaming people in terms of how they eat. Everybody has their own reasons for the choices that they make, and we just need to figure out how to present opportunities and make them more enjoyable and more attractive than other things. So but I think we're getting there, right? And you mentioned the thing about kids. How do we convince kids to eat those fruits and vegetables the same way that like McDonald's and these sports drinks are convincing kids to drink Prime and to eat potato chips and eat sugar and eat McDonald's. I mean, so I think they've got a very interesting marketing campaign, and we just need to reverse engineer and do something similar for kids.
And just real quick, because you mentioned local consumption, do you think that could be a solution?
Yeah, so it's a solution, but it's not the solution.
Because we get that question a lot, and we get a lot of hate because of it, actually.
It is, yeah, but when you look at the research, shipping food around the world doesn't really make a big difference.
Yeah.
So those individuals that are worried about their avocado coming from Mexico, it really doesn't matter. The bigger choice from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, right? The bigger choice is whether you're choosing between an avocado or a steak. That's where the big issue comes from. So great, if you have the ability to buy and eat local food, then that's a great option, but it should not become a religion where that's the solution that is going to fix everything, because it won't. And in some places, if we start to advocate for local food production and increase local food, it could actually come at the cost of actually, biodiversity loss. You think at a place like Madagascar, which has already cut down a lot of its forests. If you increase local food in that particular place, the only option that you have left is to cut down forests, right? So in some places it works, in some places it is a really good option, but in other places it doesn't. What do you do in a place like Saudi Arabia? They can't grow all of their own food. Nigeria, Iran, the UAE, which ships in 90% of its own food, right? So once again, we look at it as this giant jigsaw puzzle. Some solutions work in some places and are really good solutions, but we should not look at any one as being a panacea.
Okay, and my questions was going to be around behavior change, but I guess you already solved this question. So it's about simplifying. It's about not shaming the consumer, right? And it's about not putting all of these different trends to battle each other, but going to the simplicity of it all. What's best, and it's a few tips, right?
Yeah. However, we should not put all of the onus only on the consumer.
Exactly. And that was going to be my next question. So we tend to talk about a lot about the consumer, and many times we get also messages to the farmer, like we're farming unsustainably. And what got farmers to farm this way is a long history of policies, market,
and economics,
etc.
simply. Yeah.
So what are other key players in this, and what's their role in changing things around in here that are not always putting the focus on consumers and farmers?
Policymakers. We talked about the importance of talking to policymakers and being able to change and create policies that can enable the right conditions to flourish. That really comes back to policy, right? So how we're looking at it is that national level governments, the reason that they're tackling climate change right now is because of the Paris Agreement, which was signed back in 2015. That created the international enabling mechanism, or like the conditions to be able to create an environment where individual countries could tackle this problem, right? That led to innovation within the energy sector and transport sectors, and that's why we're trying to lift food and food systems up at the international level to kind of give countries the right conditions in order to be able to tackle them. So if they're already tackling and working on their NDCs, then just integrate food into that. If they're working on their new biodiversity strategies, the NBSAPs, then it's just integration of food into that, right? So it's definitely that. It's the national level policymakers then also too that we have to make sure that are putting the right policies in place for their country to be able to create the types of changes so that consumers have access to affordable, healthy, and safe food, right? That farmers are able to take the chances and the risks to be able to grow the types of food that we're actually asking for. So all of it needs to be looked at, right? So yes, consumers, it's important, but if we continue to market unhealthy food to kids, then it's going to be harder. If we change the laws around marketing and if we start to regulate that, then we can have more of an impact.
But of course, you need to work with policy at the national level. But in many times we see it, for example, in crowd farming, you have certain consumers and certain farmers, and you're not always sourcing your products from the same farmers you have in place, right? So you're producing for other countries and you're importing from other countries. So I guess the relationship with those other countries is also important, because you might be farming really sustainably in your country, but then sourcing from really unsustainable practices elsewhere, and you're not putting on your country, right?
Yeah, that's why we need to, again, look back at policy and demand, for example, businesses to be able to only source deforestation-free food and like commodities. That's one thing that can happen. It also comes back to the education. Like if you look at a place like Denmark, and if you start to look at impacts from certain foods, right up at the top, it's animal source foods, right? But you know what? One of it's like the second or third highest impact food that they have in Denmark is?
I'm going to guess butter.
Coffee, tea, and chocolate, cocoa. It's those novelty foods, right? So therefore, because they're being sourced from places that are having a high impact and like biodiversity loss and such. So therefore, that kind of comes back to education in terms of saying it's not always animal source foods. It's also these other source foods, and that consumers have like a responsibility not to just reduce their meat consumption and increase consumption of some of these novelty foods, and then demand for sourcing them from places that have less of an impact.
Brent, I want to slightly change topics and talk a little bit about the social and economical implications of our diets, right? So would you say, I think the answer is going to be yes, but I'm going to ask a question and then we're going to build on it. What's the relationship between economic development and healthy or unhealthy diets? And how does it relate to sustainability?
If you look at the curves, following economic development also follows increased consumption of other food, like mainly animal source foods, right? It's considered a luxury item. Along with that, is following the increased consumption of a lot of unhealthy foods as well, like or the ultra processed foods, like we also talked about. So it seems to be with rising consumption levels, that's some of the first foods that people start to want to eat more of. But there also tends to be some sort of peak economic development where at that time it feels like countries and consumers are ready to start thinking about their food in a different way. And I think Europe is there. I think there are some parts of the world where from an economic standpoint, they're starting to think about their food choices and make some of those, make some of these decisions. But in terms of what point of economic development some countries get there, I'm not sure if there's been a study that has been done on that yet. So there's absolutely some kind of connection there, right?
Yep.
So, this is something that we have to be very conscious of when we're talking about food system transformation, right? Because there are some countries that are at a different point in terms of economic development, and they're fighting very different issues. So when we're talking about dietary shifts,
Yep.
what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about taking away animal source foods from individuals that aren't maybe consuming that much to begin with, or are we saying that in many parts of the world they should be increasing consumption of some animal source foods, right? And when you look at the numbers, it's actually decreasing consumption in some parts of the world, like mainly G20 countries, and increasing in others, right? So huge connection between economic development and what people are eating, and that also has to come back to our messaging.
And should we, from a climate perspective, should we address the issue of having developing economies, for example, that are going to perhaps start a shift towards more animal source products, or what would you say, if there is something to be done or not?
Yeah, we can tackle it in the West, or in like Europe, let's say. But if the rest of the world goes down the path that we did in terms of increasing consumption of animal source foods, then it's going to be problematic for all of us. If China and Africa and many other parts of the world tend towards the overconsumption of these foods, and I'm talking overconsumption, I'm not talking consumption, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we really need to be targeting, is what does overconsumption actually mean, right? And trying to figure out how to actually get it towards that. But that's why we feel like if we can get food systems embedded into national level policy, like if it becomes part of their climate strategy, then therefore overconsumption of these animal source foods and the impact of these is automatically embedded into a global treaty or mechanism like the Paris, right? And that might be one way of actually preventing that, kind of leapfrogging some of the mistakes that we made, and being able to go from underconsumption right to the optimal intake for all foods.
And Brent, going back to how we started the conversation on protecting biodiversity, and then that led you to going into food and taking this as a systemic change to, again, go back to protect biodiversity. What does biodiversity have to do with how we eat and the consequences of sustainability? So why having more orangutans or jaguars, or why is it going to impact being healthy and being sustainable?
It might not. If we're looking at some of these iconic species like elephants and orangutans and tigers and things like that, I mean, having more of those doesn't necessarily trickle back to having an impact on us, per se. And that was one of the challenges that I always faced when I was working with these animals, is people sitting in some far off country would say, well, I want to protect orangutans, I want to do something about them. And it was really hard to actually tell them how they could do it. However, if you reverse it the other way, if people care about having those species on this planet, and if people actually truly want to live on a planet that's filled with amazing biodiversity and these wonderful species, and they like the thought of them in the wild, then the only way that we're going to be able to keep them there is through fixing our food systems, right? And that comes back to how we produce our food and what we eat. So they're definitely dependent upon us making the right choices in terms of what we put on our plate. That's one thing. But then there's also the on the ground diversity within food systems themselves. It's what's in farms, what people are producing, the diverse array of fruits and veggies and grains and millets and everything else that we used to have, but we don't have anymore, right? So that agrobiodiversity is something that we also need to capture, and that directly has an impact on our health, because the more diverse of a diet that we have, the more diverse foods that we have, the more resilient the food system is, and the healthier it is, for us. If we're only eating one or two foods, it's not very good. But the more diverse array of foods that we put onto our plate, the more healthy it is. So.
Yeah, it's funny because when we talk about biodiversity, I think the panda, it's the panda you have in WWF, it's kind of iconic, and we think about all of these kind of amazing species that are endangered. Here, for example, in Spain, the lynx. I think everyone is kind of worried about that one, but we do not consider biodiversity like having in a patch of land a lot of different insects, and we don't acknowledge how much that impacts our health or the complete change of animals, right? And how that having no microbes, maybe you have less insects. Less insects means less birds. Less birds in the south of Europe means less birds in Germany, for example. And sometimes we don't see how kind of this change of events, and we see kind of the iconic species, right? But they're of course both connected in both ways and connected to ourselves.
I think it's a harder sell. It's harder to sell for a lot of people, maybe some of those different types of biodiversity, the soil microbes and the worms and the small little critters and everything. It's much easier to sell, creatures like
they're not as cool.
So, however, they are connected, and by working on these issues, you will still end up be able, to save the bees and the birds and the worms and such.
Yeah, and we're running out of time, Brent. So I think we should really skip to the end because we have many more questions for you. But I think one question I am really dying to ask you is, what should people be talking about that we don't talk about enough in the media or even conversations at the pub? What should people be talking about with regards to sustainable diets and really healthy food systems?
I think sustainable diets is a thing people should be talking about more, right? I think that what people tend to talk about more when they're thinking about food systems are how we produce it. So we talk about organic farming or regenerative farming or different types of farming. We talk about food loss and waste. Because I think food loss and waste and how we produce our food, it's a bit less controversial, but healthy, sustainable diets is much harder for individuals to talk about, right? So it's whether it's policymakers or the individual, I think that's the topic. That's kind of the last frontier when it comes to food systems, right? So we need to figure out what each one of us can do, our organizations as individuals, what each one of us can do in terms of how we start to elevate that issue and make sure that it's at the forefront of these issues. And so policymakers know that this is absolutely important. How we do that is up to each individual, right? And I think this is where the diversity of individuals can really shine. If you're a painter, then you paint it. If you're an athlete, then you do something with athletics. If you're a parent, then you parent. If you're a singer, then sing it, right? And by being able to harness each one of those different ways that we can do it, and being able to teach people that healthy diets, sustainable diets is a key to our future, is a wonderful message.
And Brent, I'm going to end with a question that I love asking. That it's, what are you dying to talk about that people are just not asking you around these topics?
Oh, geez. I tend to talk about whatever I want.
But normally, you start talking about something, and that brings new people to ask you the same things and to expand on these topics. But sometimes it just drives away from a topic that you are really interested in a certain moment.
I'm not quite sure what that would be, but possibly weaving in a much stronger health message and the benefits of eating a healthy diet into the work that we do, because we tend to talk about why this is good for these species or these plants or these far off places, that really getting that message home about why it's good for us and why it's good for our kids and how this can actually change our lives. The role of exercise and sleep and food and how that can transform individuals, I think, is something that we could do a better job in terms of weaving that message in, getting the medical community on board with some of these messages, right? And really thinking about using food as medicine is another thing that we could definitely be talking about more.
Perfect. I'll take this as homework to start including that, because it's something we've been super cautious with, and I think the time is now, and we need to start looking into this. We started with a few things, like, for example, the Mediterranean diet. We included that in a podcast, but regenerative farming is bringing along a lot of studies around this topic, and I think it's the time to start speaking about this. So I'll get the homework and get to it. From now.
Since we're not scientists, we don't want to overstep But since we have a scientist with us today, it's great that you've got that point of authority that we don't have.
It's time to be bold, right? It's time to create the zeitgeist. It's time to do all that stuff. So, yeah.
Well, Brent, it's been an absolute joy to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you also to our viewers, to our listeners. Thank you for joining us one more day at What the Field. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.